Euphemism late at night. 7 Pinster Street. Leonard Mitchell sat on a chair with his legs raised onto the side of his desk. Following that, he leaned back, causing the wooden headrest to creak from the pressure. His breathing gradually turned long and slow. After an unknown period of time, his eyelids drooped and covered his eyes. At this moment, Leonard's spirit had arrived in a gray, hazy world, but he was still in his bedroom. He flew to the window and saw thick gray fog blanket the nearby streets and extend outward. It seemed to be embracing all of Backline. The street lamps along the streets and the warm light from the different houses appeared abnormally dim. They were only able to illuminate a very tiny region, and everything seemed to be tainted with a sense of blurriness. At the same time, blobs of illusory oval lights appeared as they enveloped a house in an intersecting manner, as though it was the source of their existence. This was the city through a nightmare's eye. Leonard followed up on his previous investigations and leaped out the window in a nightmare state. He then flew to 17 Mint Street. He didn't attempt to storm in. He stood at the door in the thick fog as he politely pulled the doorbell. Cuckoo! Cuckoo! Dressed in her nightgown, Stellan Sammer opened the door. She placed her silver-inlaid pleated fan at her chest as she asked in confusion and puzzlement, "Who are you looking for?" She was none other than Klein's landlord back when he was acting as Sherlock Moriarty. She was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed lady in her 30s. Leonard had already changed into a black and white checkered police uniform. He casually showed his identification and asked, "Do you know Sherlock Moriarty?" Trapped in the dream, Stellan's reaction was very slow. She asked after a few seconds, "Did something happen to him?" Just as she asked, her impression of Sherlock Moriarty appeared beside her under Leonard's influence. He wore a half-top hat, a double-breasted frock coat, gold-rimmed spectacles on his nose, and a bushy mustache around his mouth. This was identical to the information he previously received about Sherlock Moriarty. Hence, he didn't show any doubts and said, "He's been involved in a case and is undergoing an investigation. Hope you can cooperate with us." All right. Stellan wished to raise her chin, but for some reason she felt a little horrified. Leonard thought for a second and asked, "Since when did he rent this place from you?" "Early September last year," Stellan said after recalling her memory. Leonard continued asking, "What do you know of him? Or should I say, what kind of person do you think he is?" When that was mentioned, Stellan appeared as though she had long considered the answer to such a question. "He comes from Midseashire, and he has an accent from that area. He's a very capable detective, and he once exposed the adultery which Mary's husband was undertaking. However, his income isn't too high. He doesn't even hire a full-time housemaid. All he can do is get my maid to help him part-time. My children tell me that he's good at telling stories, especially detective-related stories." This might be why he had chosen this profession. Without giving Leonard a chance to interrupt her, she droned on incessantly, "He's not as boorish like the typical detective. He went to grammar school and studied history. What leaves me most envious of all is how he obtained Mary's gratitude. He joined the Quelog Club, where its members are people with significant status. I've only been there a few times. Later, he apparently became famous in the detective circles, and private detectives often came to look for him." Leonard lost his patience listening to her drone on as he couldn't help but rub his temples. He had failed to obtain any useful information from Mrs. Stellan. Apart from Sherlock Moriarty's poor financial situation and him being good at telling detective stories, the rest was within the scope of what he had previously investigated. He even knew that Sherlock Moriarty had good ties with Isengard Stant. "Next, I'll investigate those from the Quelog Club who have good relationships with Sherlock Moriarty." Once he patiently finished listening to Mrs. Stellan's droning, he immediately thanked her and left her dream. 160 Bachland Street. Inside Dwayne Dante's mansion, in the hall that could accommodate more than 100 dancers, Klein was embracing a lady in her 30s as they danced. This was the etiquette teacher that Walter had hired. Her name was Wahana Heisen. She had a common name, but she wasn't ordinary at all. Her facial features were only above average, but her disposition was impeccable. Her every action was filled with charm. According to Walter's introduction, she was born in a baron's family. She received a good education from a young age and later entered the palace. She had the job of court lady until she was married. As her family had declined, and her husband's financial situation was only ordinary, being a believer in the Evernight, Goddess prompted her to choose to become a private tutor in etiquette. She often went to the families of nobles and tycoons to teach their children. Although the butler didn't spell it out, Klein knew that he couldn't perform badly in front of this lady, or there was no way to save his reputation. The way members of high society asked about a person's situation was mainly through common acquaintances. And at times, the interaction between servants also mattered. With nimble footsteps and graceful moves, the black-haired Wahana nodded approvingly. Mr. Dentes, it's hard for me to imagine you not having learned these dance steps before. In less than half an hour, you're as skilled as a noble who received education on this from a young age. TT's all thanks to your teaching. Klein gave a humble smile as he wore a warm, humble look. With the clown's balance, dancing was a very easy matter for him. Wahana lowered her head and chuckled softly. You're a gentleman who can really make a lady happy. She immediately raised her light brown eyes and swept her gaze across Dwayne Dantes's silver sideburns and deep blue eye. That's the best praise I've heard today, Klein replied with a smile. During this period, his feet kept moving as he spun Wahana gently around. Not far away, the hired quartet's melodious music echoed through the hall. He had the intention to have close ties with Wahana, not to improve his reputation, but because she was once a court lady. After Wahana corrected a minor mistake that Dwayne Dentes committed, she said, when inviting a lady to dance, it's not only a dance. You also need to converse. It can't be like two doll, unless both of you are so immersed in the dance and music's rhythm that you do not wish to speak. Of course, that's also a form of communication of the heart. When conversing, you must be euphemistic because this is loan, not intis. To put it simply, do not be direct and crude. You need to appear gentlemanly. Let me raise an example. If you wish to compliment a lady for her perfume, you can't directly tell her how nice it smells, nor ask what kind of perfume it is to praise her. You need to connect a more euphemistic meaning to it and mention that. Yes, you can say something like, it feels like I'm out in the spring meadow. Of course, this needs to match the traits of perfume. There's no literary feel. Shouldn't you say that, the moon is beautiful, isn't it? Klein lampooned with a Japanese-styled euphemism as he said with a self-deprecating smile, thank you for not telling me that my praises weren't gentlemanly enough. Wahana's smile deepened. Mr. Dentes, do you know what kind of gentleman is very welcomed by women at social events? Pray do tell. Klein honestly shook his head. Wahana said without a change in her smile, the second most popular type are men who make women think that he's very intelligent. What about the first? Klein asked cooperatively. Wahana glanced at him and said, the most popular type are men who make women think that they are very intelligent. Upon saying that, she smiled and didn't say another word. Klein instantly understood she was hiding her praise in between the lines. So this is loan-styled euphemism. It's not like intis where they just aim straight for the lower half of the body. That's what's written in papers and magazines. I've no way of confirming what real intis social events are like. Anyway, both countries often sully each other. The Emperor's era does match that description, though. Klein nodded in enlightenment. The 2-hour etiquette lesson ended in a harmonious mood. Klein walked teacher Wahana Heisen to the door with butler Walter and valet Richardson, before giving her a tiny gift. It was Moonlight, a perfume from the Dream Company. It was mixed with gray amber, making it rather expensive. As for how much it was, Klein wasn't sure, as housekeeper Tanja was responsible for buying it. The payment was through her. Only when the £1,000 was almost expended would she come to him with receipts and a list for him to vet so as to receive fresh funds. The reason why Klein knew the company and perfume was that his butler had informed him ahead of time. It was to prevent him from appearing insincere if Ma'am Wahana were to ask. From this detail, he had a deep understanding of the use of a good butler. Watching the satisfied Ma'am Wahana Heisen leave, Klein held back the urge to rub his temples as he sighed inwardly. This is more tiring than a Bay-under battle. I have to constantly watch my actions and deliberate over my words. I need some rest. At that point, the white-gloved Walter took a step forward and said, Sir, since you wish for your etiquette studies to progress faster, we can move the remaining lessons forward. What lessons? Klein felt a headache. History, international politics, philosophy, music, as well as general knowledge of sports like golf, racing, hunting. Walter answered meticulously. Philosophy? Klein asked in surprise. Walter nodded. TT is one of the most common topics discussed in high society. You don't need to have very deep research into it, but you need to know what others are discussing. You need to know that the origins of philosophy stem from Kunsoka, Merdi, and Patterson, and not Emperor Roselle. You need to know that man was born free came from Lumi. When tycoons first enter high society, many of them often make mistakes in such aspects. They're used to attributing certain sentences and philosophical thoughts to Emperor Roselle. Klein felt his head ache the more he heard. He forcefully smiled and said, I haven't got any matters to do recently, apart from my afternoon naps and heading to the cathedral. You can arrange the lessons to be at any time. In a dark room, a letter floated up and opened by itself before shaking the piece of paper. In her tiny bonnet, Sharon's figure was outlined. She grasped the letter and seriously read through it. She then wrote a reply and set up a ritual to summon Sherlock Moriarty's messenger. During this process, she didn't forget to prepare a gold coin. Soon, Sharon finished the incantation as she watched the candle flame burgeon and be tainted with a gloomy green color. Rionette Tinker, with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in hand, appeared out of the candlelight and appeared before Sharon. Sharon's eyes constricted as her doll-like face suddenly showed immense emotional fluctuation. She blurted out, Teacher, haven't you already? 160 Bachland Street. In the sunny study, the bookshelves were orderly arranged with a huge collection. At a glance, one appeared as though they had stepped into a private library. Klein sat on a high-backed chair as he read the newspaper. He discovered that be it the Tussock Times or the Bachland Daily Tribune, there was an additional advertisement in a striking spot. It advertised selling 10% of the Bachland Bike Company's share. Mr. Stanton is rather efficient. It's only been a few days, and he has completed the financial checks and evaluation. Klein silently reflected on the matter when his spiritual perception was triggered. He quickly activated his spirit vision and saw Rionette Tinker walk out of the void. She still held the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in her hand, with one of them having a letter in its mouth. It's likely a reply from Miss Sharon. As Klein had these thoughts, he reached out to receive it and nodded. Thank you. As he spoke, he subconsciously glanced at the door because standing outside was his valet, Richardson. After tearing open the envelope and unfolding the letter, Klein quickly scanned it, confirming that it was written by Sharon. She indicated that she had no intention of buying biological poison bottle, and she might only consider it after a period of time if it was still available. She's in a tight financial situation. Or is she saving money to do something important? Klein casually thought and instinctively felt that it was the latter. This was because it was impossible for the demigod named Zatwin to keep staying in Bachland. For now, Sharon and Merrick had escaped the pursuit of the Rose School of Thought, and with their Beyonder powers and unique traits about their sequences, it wasn't difficult for them to amass money in a relaxed environment. Furthermore, they seemed to be in charge of the illegal arms dealing in the Bravehearts bar, and they were the backers behind Ian. Just this alone would make them plenty of money. As he thought about it, Klein looked up and saw Miss Messenger's 8 red eyes looking at him intently. He jumped in fright, imagining that she was urging him to pay the debt he owed her. He cleared his throat and said, There's no need to reply. TLL be paying the first installment within the week. Rionette Tinker's 4 heads spoke one after another. There's no rush. There's no interest. Miss Messenger is quite nice after all. As Klein sighed, Rionette Tinker vanished from her spot, returning back into the depths of the spirit world. After burning the letter and resting for half an hour, he walked to the door to inform Richardson to prepare the carriage. He planned on heading to the cathedral before his philosophy class in the afternoon. The journey there was smooth sailing, and Klein arrived at the square outside St. Samuel Cathedral after a few sips of tea. After gaining the serenity from taking in the sights of the pigeons, he strode towards the cathedral's main door, entered the prayer hall, and randomly found a pew to sit at. Like before, Richardson sat diagonally behind him with his master's hat and cane. As he emptied his mind during his prayers, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered once again. He instinctively opened his eyes and looked left. He saw the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell. This nighthawk wasn't wearing a trench coat. He looked casual with his white shirt tucked out, while matching them with straight trousers and a black vest. Seeing the middle-aged man with gray streaks at his sideburns look at him, he smiled with a nod, retracted his gaze, and closed his eyes in a bid to pretend to pray. He wasn't worried that the man would discover that he was watching him, because he had only done a cursory sweep without any additional action. Many believers present had similar actions as well. It was inevitable for a good-looking, dignified gentleman to attract some attention when he entered. Leonard Mitchell was someone who often attracted such attention, so he knew this very well. At this moment, the slightly aged voice sounded in his mind. "It's him. He didn't make my hard work of running over to the cathedral yesterday, and today be in vain," Leonard thought smugly as his expression remained stoic. Klein was also pretending to pray as puzzlement surfaced in his thinking mind. When did this fellow Leonard become so pious? Although he's definitely more pious than me, he's not the kind of person who would come to the cathedral every day. He would come once or twice a week at best. What's his goal for coming? He seemed to be observing me just now. Upon having this thought, Klein suddenly realized something. The grandpa in him is the angel of the Zoroast family, which makes him an angel of the marauder pathway. Blasphemer Ammon is a king of angels of this pathway. He could discover the gray fog and even tried to infiltrate it. So, it's very possible that the grandpa in Leonard can also sense the gray fog or the traces of its powers on me. Upon making this judgment, Klein immediately felt his heart in his throat. He felt like dangerous traps were surrounding him. He maintained his praying posture, and the eyes under his eyelids remained motionless. His entire person was calm and reserved, completely identical to the cathedral's atmosphere. After an unknown period of time, he slowly got up and walked to the altar. He came before the donation box and threw in a total of £50 in cash. Following that, he did the same as before, smiling at the bishop and priest on duty while nodding. He received a rather friendly response. The moment he walked out of St. Samuel Cathedral, Klein received his hat from Richardson, and he fed the pigeons on the square for about 10 minutes. And behind him, the believers who had finished their prayers walked out, including Leonard Mitchell. Without looking at the entrance, Klein leisurely clapped his hands, took his gold inlaid cane, and walked to the nearby four-wheeled carriage. Leonard was similarly feeding the pigeons on the square, but he didn't have any intention of following when he saw his target leave on the carriage. Since the person had an ancient aura, and that the parasite in him placed such importance on him, he obviously didn't dare to be careless. He didn't act directly, as it was extremely dangerous. He planned on making superficial investigations to gather the required intelligence. I'll see what old man has to say when the time comes. Besides, it's not like there's no direction for investigation at the moment. There can't be that many of that particular type of high-end carriage in back. No matter if it's his or if it's rented, it's easy to determine the source. Then I'll know the identity and background of that gentleman. Leonard glanced at the pigeons as he thought leisurely. He was an experienced nighthawk, and he was even an elite red glove among the nighthawks. At this moment, a pigeon spread its wings and flew over. In its beak there appeared to be a paper slip. Leonard frowned as he reached out his left palm and saw the pigeon fly down before dropping the slip. Then it flapped its wings and flew off. Raising the paper slip, Leonard warily unfolded it while feeling puzzled. He saw 2 lines of text on it, Zoroast parasite. This, Leonard's pupils suddenly constricted as he felt all his hair stand up. His emotions nearly exploded at that very instant. That gentleman has seen through my secret. As expected of someone with an ancient aura. He might be one of the undying monsters that remained from the 4th epoch. He's warning me that I shouldn't involve myself in his matters or even come close to him. At that moment, Leonard felt that every action the middle-aged man with white sideburns and blue eyes had done had left him shocked when he recalled them. He was someone not to be looked at directly or approached. He immediately lost all thoughts of investigating the man. As he watched the pigeons land, he said with a suppressed voice, "Old man, he might be an old friend of yours. If you wish to investigate, then it's best that you wait till your strength recovers." "Old friend." The slightly aged voice repeated the 2 words as though he found it suspect but couldn't be certain. Leonard quickly converged his emotions and chuckled. "So you're someone from the Zoroast family." At this moment, about 100 meters away, at the intersection of Phelps Street and the other streets, the black-haired Dwayne Dantes, who had streaks of gray hair, leaned onto the wall as he slowly closed his eyes, hiding his wrinkled facial features in the shadows of the carriage. The side of his valet, Richardson, a middle-aged man wearing a dark red coat and old triangular hat, appeared, bowing to his master before disappearing. No one saw this illusory figure. The carriage slowly turned as a flock of pigeons flew up from the square. After returning home and entering the room with the huge balcony, the silent Klein finally heaved a silent sigh of relief. If Leonard didn't accept the warning because of the grandpa's bewitchment, he planned on writing another slip with the contents. I know where Blasphemer Ammon is. In between the lines, it means I'll tell Blasphemer Ammon that there's a Zoroast family angel here if you foil my plan. This wouldn't make the grandpa believe that Dwayne Dentes was so weak that he had to rely on others to fend him off. It was more of a friendly warning that wouldn't number beyond 3 times, a form of respect towards an angel. If 2 warnings weren't enough to rein him in, there was no other choice but to inform Blasphemer Ammon. Yes, there's a very high chance that this would scare them. There must be other ploys or difficulties for this grandpa to choose to parasitize in such a shallow manner. He likely doesn't wish for me to flip the table, heh. This matter is all thanks to Arrows. If he hadn't informed me ahead of time that Leonard has a marauder angel, I definitely wouldn't have noticed that I've been targeted, much less have the suitable excuse and method to warn them. Klein thought calmly and didn't show the anxiety or flustered state from before. As he relaxed, there was a knock on the door. His valet, Richardson, said, "Sir, the butler wishes to seek an audience with you. Please invite him in." Klein left the balcony and returned to the half-open room. The white-gloved Walter entered and said, "Sir, your philosophy teacher, Mr. Hamid, is here." Philosophy classes, Klein rubbed his aching temple. He had previously heard from Walter that Mr. Hamid was a believer of the Lord of Storms. It was the same for the famous scholar, Lumi, as well. Many of the philosophers in the Lone Kingdom shared the same faith. This made him rather surprised because, to him, believers in the storm were irascible bros. From the looks of it, I have to change my stereotypes and subjective impressions. The prerequisite to being a philosopher is to not have a wife, or not have a cordial relationship with their family. As Klein lampooned, he straightened his clothes and walked to the door. He said to butler Walter, "All right, I'll head over there now." After the philosophy class, Klein had a feeling as though he hadn't slept in 3 days. His mind was filled with names and concepts like skepticism, metaphysics, a priori and a posteriori, nominalism, Roselle socialism, existentialism, and positivism. If it wasn't because the original Klein had studied history, which included some mastery of philosophy, he doubted that he had the ability to last through the lesson. This wasn't his college lessons on Earth. They were one-to-one, making it impossible for him to sleep, daydream, or read novels on his cell phone when he didn't understand the content. Actually, Mr. Hamid was quite different from what I had imagined. He was humorous, candid, and extroverted. His lesson wasn't dull, making him unlike a philosophy teacher. He also doesn't possess the stereotypes of a Lord of Storms believer. Klein rubbed his temples, turned to leave, and walked to the staircase. He returned to the 3rd floor as his valet, Richardson, followed him in silence. During this process, he discovered that his servants were busy with their own duty. None of them were lazing about, and they would only stop when their employer walked past. They would bow and greet him, clearly indicating how well-mannered they were. Tanja is very capable when it comes to the arrangement and management of household matters after all. Klein walked through the corridor on the 3rd floor and walked to the half-open room. Before he walked in, Klein saw butler Walter hanging 2 double-barreled hunting rifles on the wall, making the interior have a raw and bold feeling. This was a decoration every tycoon's home had. It's very easy to get approved for a hunting license. A double-barreled hunting rifle is potent, enough to allow the servants to fend off any criminals who wish to burgle or kidnap. After hanging the rifle up, Walter took 2 steps back and observed the hunting rifle. He then took out a golden pocket watch from his inner pocket. He opened the pocket watch and looked at the lid's interior. His stern, old-fashioned face softened significantly. Klein coughed gently to inform his butler before pushing open the ajar door and walked in. Walter closed the pocket watch, returned to his spot and bowed. "Sir, we applied for 6 hunting licenses and bought 6 double-barreled hunting rifles and the corresponding canister cartridges." Klein had Death Knell hiding under his armpit, so he didn't mind it too much. All he did was nod as a form of acknowledgement. He then revealed a warm smile and asked as though having a casual chat, "Back when I saw the information from the Family Servant Assistants Association, I noticed that you already have a wife and child." A butler was the assistant to the employer. He was a confidant that knew many matters. Therefore, establishing rapport with the butler was something every employer had to do. Klein didn't wish to be an exception. Furthermore, he remembered Arrows mentioning that butler Walter could result in additional developments. Walter answered in all seriousness. Yes, back when I was a servant at the Viscount Conrad's manor, I had to have constant contact with a lady due to work. We began having feelings for each other, and under the goddess's watch, we walked down the aisle of marriage and ended up having a daughter. She's currently studying at a grammar school and wishes to pass the Backland University's entrance exam. However, that's something to consider only 2 years later. Upon mentioning his wife and daughter, this unsmiling butler's tone unknowingly turned mellow. At present, all the churches were emphasizing the importance of family. It was to stem the stress and mental problem that arose due to the tide of technological progress. The only difference was that different churches emphasized different matters. For Evernight, men and women were equal as they helped one another in the family. For Storm, men were to work outside, while women were to handle the family to be the former's supportive angel. For Steam, it was more about learning more and to have technology do more of the work. All of them had their strengths, and they complemented each other. Klein felt wistful hearing that as he said, "Ma'am Tanja seems to be single." "Yes." Walter's expression turned solemn again. In modern society, male and female servants still do not enjoy equal treatment. I'm not referring to the salary, as a housekeeper is at the same level as a butler or butler assistant, earning 25 to 50 pounds a year. Instead, I'm talking about a deeper idea and belief. The church is trying to change it, but there's plenty of resistance. After all, the goddess isn't the only belief in loan. He paused and added, "Male servants can get married, but if a female servant were to have a family, it implies the loss of her job or becoming the lowest laundress who's only a part-time employee that doesn't need to live at the employer's residence. All of these will change only when one reaches the rank of housekeeper. But this isn't something a young and inexperienced lady is qualified for." Klein didn't continue on the topic as he nodded gently. He then walked towards the reclining chair. At this moment, his gaze swept by the piled newspaper by the coffee table. His mind stirred as he paused, turned to the side and said to his butler, "I saw an advertisement on the papers regarding the sale of Backland Bike Company shares. Find a professional lawyer, an accountant to inquire about it to figure out the exact situation. Heh, I'm rather interested in this industry. If the price is right, I'll consider buying it." For a second, Klein thought of a problem. As a tycoon who had brought huge sums of money to Backland to seek out better opportunities, it was impossible that he didn't pay attention to the sale of the Backland Bike Company share. Since he didn't know the prospects of this industry, he needed to hire people to gain a better understanding of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit his persona. Of course, I can also raise the price as a result, allowing me to sell those 10% shares at a higher price. Yes, I have to remember to just raise the price a little and not be too greedy. If I were to keep raising the price and it ends up back in my hands, I'll be crying. It would throw all my liquidity into it, and I won't be able to maintain my daily expenses. As Klein fantasized, he warned himself. "Yes, sir." Walter didn't ask further, as he directly agreed. At 4:35 p.m., Richardson knocked on the door and entered. He said to Dwayne Dentes, who was reading leisurely, "Sir, Mr. Maury Mact and his wife, Ma'am Rihanna, as well as St. Samuel Cathedral's Bishop Electra, is here to pay you a visit." Maury Mact, that House of Commons member of Parliament. Also, why would St. Samuel Cathedral's bishop be here as well? Klein thought and asked with a smile, "Is there such a protocol?" He had only attended 2 etiquette lessons and knew that at his stage, visits wouldn't be that direct. People would first send their butlers or servants to hand over an invitation or schedule a visit. Richardson habitually lowered his head and said, "Yes. TT's because Mr. Butler informed the neighbors that you would be home in the afternoon for the next week when he was delivering your name cards and gifts. Under such a situation, neighbors who received your name card and have heard about you will observe the corresponding detail. Not only can they send their servants to invite you over, but they can also pass by on the excuse of being out on an afternoon stroll from 4 to 5 to make a semi-formal visit. Oh, the ladies will wear strolling attire, otherwise it wouldn't be decent enough. You can also invite them to have afternoon tea with you." Klein walked to the door and allowed Richardson to retrieve his coat to help him wear it. He then asked, "Then why would Bishop Electra be here as well?" This was what he really cared about most. The first question was to lead up to it. Richardson answered as though he had prepared an answer. "Bishop Electra was a guest at Member of Parliament Mac's house in the afternoon. They must have mentioned you while having a chat and decided to pay a visit by strolling over. His hands weren't affected by his talking. He skillfully helped Dwayne Dentes adjust his attire. Klein tersely acknowledged, and after Richardson went forward to open the door, he walked out. Soon, he saw the three visitors in a small living room on the second floor. Maury Mact was a classic Lonese gentleman. He was in his 40s, and he had black hair and brown eyes. He had a deep outline with a receding hairline. His face was a little thin and long. He was formerly in the military and had entered politics after being discharged. He started his career in Backland until he became a member of Parliament of the Kingdom's House of Commons. He was a believer of the Evernight Goddess and a member of the New Party. He was in support of improving the environment. His wife, Rihanna, was from a family of lawyers. She provided plenty of funding for her husband's political ambitions, and she was also a believer of the Evernight Goddess. Electra wore a black, double-breasted clergyman's robe. He looked to be 40, and he had deep blue eyes and a thin face. He wasn't good-looking, but for some baffling reason, he was pleasing to the eye. Klein had once met this bishop when he was donating money into the donation box. Upon seeing Dwayne Dentes appear, Maury Mac took 2 steps forward and chuckled. I've been hearing for the past few days that a pious believer in the goddess had moved into Unit 160, and I've been wanting to visit. We happened to be taking a stroll today, and we took the liberty to visit. Please pardon us for our faux pas. Klein smiled and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. At such times, the only thing we need to do is praise the lady. Praise the lady. Electra and Rihanna nodded as they drew a crimson moon on their chests. After exchanging pleasantries, Klein invited his 3 guests to take a seat. A maid hurriedly delivered some tea and coffee. Housekeeper Tanja had already asked each one of them what they wanted prior. Mr. Dentes, I heard you're a merchant from Daisy. I wonder what business you were previously engaged in. Maury Mact asked casually before joking. Your last name just makes me think of many things. He was referring to the protagonist's name of a particular best-selling novel written by Emperor Roselle. Klein smiled and humorously asked in return, what kind of business does digging up treasure count as? This was also related to the content of said best-selling novel. Without waiting for the member of Parliament to answer him, he said the answer he had long fabricated. I once had my own mine, but as you know, it will one day be mined out. Mining cities would also end up waning as a result. It was hinting that he was born in one of the resource-rich cities in Daisy County. Their gangs were rampant, and there were many secret tycoons. If ordinary people were to attempt to investigate Dwayne Dantes's situation, it would take them at least half a year. Bishop Electra nodded in thought as he asked, so, you chose to come to Backland to seek out new opportunity. May I know who proselytized you into the church? Klein had already walked through Bishop Electra's last question before, so he said with a sigh, it was my father. He was a truly wise elder. Unfortunately, he passed away many years ago during an accident. When he said that, he infused the original Klein's emotions of losing his parents, him being in an alternate world with no home to return to, as well as the scars that resulted from his time in Tingen City. He sounded calm and wore a slight smile, but there was a sorrow that lasted forever that remained hidden deep inside. Team, sorry for your loss. He must have entered the holy residence of the goddess, sleeping peacefully under her watch, Bishop Electra answered sincerely as he formed the sign of the crimson moon on his chest. Without waiting for Dwayne Dentes to respond, he looked at him and invited him. There will be a moon mass the day after tomorrow for the deceased. It will help him sleep in the goddess's nation and receive eternal peace. I wonder if you're interested in participating. The Church of the Evernight Goddess didn't have many festivals, and the most important one was Winter Gifts Day. The second most important was the Mass held during the full moon, also known as the Moon Mass. The rest were just normal masses and prayers on weekends. However, different dioceses and different cathedrals had their own patron saints and angels, which would have a corresponding special festival for them. T would love to. Klein stood up and bowed, saying it from the bottom of his heart. This gave him the perfect excuse to interact with the bishops and priests of St. Samuel Cathedral, or even the diocese bishop. He had a firm foundation for entering particular regions in the cathedral. Meanwhile, he came to realize why the Evernight pathway was interchangeable with the death pathway. Both wielded the authorities of serenity, eternal sleep and darkness. It represented the end and a destination. Following that, Maury Mack didn't continue the topic regarding Dwayne Dantes' identity and background. It appeared as though he had only been asking in passing. He and his wife, Rihanna, began idly talking about their vacation experience in Daisy Bay last year. Having filled the gaps on this by staying there for 2 days, Klein replied with a native tone as he shared his thoughts on the Daisy specialty, roasted fish. During this process, he also pretended to unintentionally mention his hunting activities while he was doing business in West Balham, and how he was extremely familiar with the primitive forest over there. This was to build up the necessary foundations for the second layer to Dwayne Dantes' identity. Furthermore, West Balham was different from East Balham. The colonial factions from Lone and Intis were on par, allowing for frequent conflicts. Even the actively controlled regions would experience changes from time to time. To investigate the activity trajectories of a merchant or adventurer wasn't easy at all. This was even more so the case when Dwayne Dantes was likely using a fake name. As for his hunting experience in West Balham's primitive forest, Klein didn't randomly fabricate stories, nor did he plagiarize articles from the magazines or newspapers. He used what the Fog Sea's strongest hunter, Anderson, had previously mentioned regarding his glorious deeds as a blueprint. He drew on the details and abandoned the main storyline. What he fabricated was partially true and fake as well. Upon hearing the thick anacondas, man-eating fishes, and flowers which could capture their own prey in the forests, Rihanna would let out gasps from time to time, looking afraid but also eager to know more. As for the Member of Parliament and Bishop, they were equally interested. They often had to force themselves to interrupt Dwayne Dantes' description to ask about the detail. "You really are an excellent hunter. Back when I was serving in East Balham, I never had the chance to enter the forest. I never expected it to be this dangerous." After this extremely dignified middle-aged gentleman finished his tales, Maury Mack picked up a tiny piece of velvet cake and praised sincerely. "I wish to invite you to go hunting if there's a chance in the future." As they conversed, a maid had delivered the afternoon tea pastry. A male servant served them from the side. Upon hearing Member of Parliament Mack's semi-serious invitation, Klein replied with a smile, "I'm already looking forward to it." After chatting a little more and discussing Backland's pollution control, the 3 guests suggested they take their leave. As they had only acquainted themselves and weren't considered familiar with each other, Klein didn't retain them. He sent them to the door with his valet, Richardson. As he watched the bishop, Member of Parliament, and his wife leave, Klein's smile slowly disappeared until there was nothing left. He was rather pleased with the progress he had made. Bishop Electra was directly related to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, which was the main goal for him to return to Backland. Maury Mack was a discharged soldier and a Member of Parliament at present. Without a doubt, he belonged to certain military officer clubs, and he would be beneficial to his continued investigation of the Great Smog of Backland. Next up, I should slowly deepen our relationships. Klein returned to the small living room and saw that the maid had taken away the remaining pastries and tea. He originally planned on having a little more. Regardless of the other types of food, the pastries and desserts in Lone, especially Backland, were outstanding. As for the cook which Dwayne Dantes had hired, he was skilled in that. Even Ma'am Rihanna was filled with praise about it. Klein also agreed from the bottom of his heart. Retracting his gaze, Klein didn't say a word as he steadily walked to the staircase that led to the 3rd floor. Before dinner, Butler Walter finally returned to the house and briefed him on the situation regarding the 10% of Backland Bike Company's share. "Sir, we are lucky enough. Someone had hired a professional lawyer and accountant to investigate the situation of the Backland Bike Company, and they had offered a price to the seller before the advertisements were published. But in subsequent negotiations, the price exceeded the buyer's expectation. He had no choice but to give up. This way, we don't have to wait for the investigation report. We can directly hire that original team." Klein nodded and asked without hiding anything, "What's the current bid?" The buyer that gave up had offered £6,000 with a bottom-line price of £7,000. The seller didn't divulge the situation about the other buyer. However, from the feedback from various channels, it's at least £8,000. £8,000. Not too bad. Should I raise it a little more? If I were to raise the price a little and the other party just gives up, wouldn't it be awkward? Klein nodded slightly and said, "Give me the corresponding report. I'll consider it." After flipping through the report and having dinner to accentuate his extravagant but brilliant image as someone who did solid work, Klein turned his head to Richardson and said, "Prepare the two-wheel carriage. He'll be making a trip outside." He originally imagined that Richardson would ask him in surprise. A two-wheeled carriage didn't seem befitting enough, but to his surprise, his valet answered politely after flashing a curious look. "All right, sir." Submissive and never asking why. That's also considered an advantage, Klein sighed inwardly, as he waited for Richardson to return to help him wear his coat. After getting on the two-wheeled carriage, he directly instructed, "Let's circle around the Backland Bridge area in East Borough." Richardson still didn't ask about his master's motives, and just got the coachman to steer the horses carefully. As the carriage passed through Sherwood Borough, it arrived in the Backland Bridge area under the illumination of the street lamps. Klein didn't give a destination, and he only got the coachman to meander through the nearby streets. He leaned against the carriage wall, looking out at the streets. He saw pedestrians in old clothes, walking along with tired faces as though they were in a rush to return home for dinner after a hard day's work. Occasionally, there would be the ringing of a bike passing by. They were fast as they shot into the distance. In comparison, the rider's expression appeared more lively than the pedestrian. They seemed to beam with an indescribable sense of pride. It's an obvious difference in class. Although it's the difference between a technical worker and an ordinary worker, with the difference in weekly salaries of £1 to £2 to those with £1 a week, Klein slowly exhaled as he subconsciously looked up at the sky. At that moment, darkness had already completely covered Backland skies, but the smog wasn't too serious. One could see through them and see the twinkling stars. After the great smog, the management of the environment is improving by the day, however. The situation with the lower-class workers in the East Borough hasn't significantly improved. Although their salaries might be higher and their working hours have improved, due to the large number of people surging in, prices have risen across the board, reducing the effects of the salary hike. The improvement in working hours have just gone from 15-16 hours to 11-12 hours. They're just fixing the problems with the greatest problem. As for the other problems that didn't rear their ugly heads, they're neglected. Yes, the kingdom is still undergoing reforms. Many things haven't been straightened out. Klein watched as his thoughts drifted until the carriage left Sherwood Borough. On the future Admiral of Stars, Catlia stood behind the windows in the captain's cabin, watching Frank Lee pushing wooden barrels into the shadow. He was putting unknown things into it before closing the lid. He's recently been researching the growth of plants in dark environments. Why did he suddenly become normal? Catlia frowned with suspicion, often worrying that Frank Lee would create some huge invention. I'll get Nina to ask later. Just as she had this thought, her spiritual perception was triggered. She turned her head to see a letter on her desk. As a faint smile curled on her lips without her realizing it, Catlia walked over, tore open the envelope, and unfolded the letter. She quickly read through it. There are 2 obelisk's that do not belong to the Church of Storms swimming north from Sonia Island towards the Abyss Maelstrom. Find the direct descendant of Abraham family. You did well. Abyss Maelstrom was the name of a dangerous area at sea, and not the abyss. Abraham family, Catlia thought for a moment, and without any clues she planned on asking at the next tarot gathering. The next morning, after divining again if he should raise the price again, Klein said to butler Walter, "Hire that team and continue the negotiation. My bottom line is £9,000. "All right, sir." Walter then immediately said with an apologetic look, "Something happened at home, and I wish to have half a day off." "No problem. Do you need any help?" Klein asked gently. "Thank you for asking. I can handle it, and it's not too urgent." "I will first handle the matters regarding the share negotiation first," Walter said sincerely. Klein didn't ask further as he nodded and permitted him to take time off. After his butler left the room, Klein turned to look at Richardson and asked, "Did Walter meet anyone earlier this morning?" "Mr. Butler received a letter," Richardson replied without hiding anything. "Receptionist, he received a letter. Didn't he say that something happened at home? Walter's family lives in Backland, so if there really is anything wrong, then they can directly come over via public carriage or a rental carriage. Wouldn't that be faster than sending a message by mail? With his salary and land in the countryside, he can definitely afford it." Klein nodded without a word as though he had just asked in passing. He slowly returned to the reclining chair, sat down, and began to seriously read the paper. Upon seeing this, Richardson didn't say a thing as he silently retreated out of the room and quietly closed the wooden door. After hearing the light click, Klein cast his gaze away from the papers and towards the door. He thought, "I've discovered another advantage of Richardson. He enjoys observing his surroundings, and he's able to notice information of value." Back when Bishop Electra was a guest at Member of Parliament Maury Mack's place, he was the first one to notice it from the balcony. However, this is different from a spectator. The focus is more on the event rather than the details. Walter's matter seems a little abnormal. Could this be the additional development Arrows mentioned? Regardless, I'll first divine the matter. I don't want danger to come to me without me realizing it. With this in mind, Klein immediately entered the bathroom, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and arrived above the gray fog. Every time he appeared as the Fool, his inner shell beneath the gray fog would wear Klein Morty's appearance. It wouldn't overlap with Sherlock Moriarty, J.M. Sparrow, or Dwayne Dantes. Due to the lack of necessary information, he could only divine about any danger that targeted himself. Therefore, he didn't use dream divination. He removed the spirit pendulum around his wrist and wrote the corresponding divination statement. Walter's abnormality will bring me danger. Holding the spirit pendulum in his left hand, Klein closed his eyes and entered cogitation as he muttered the sentence he had just said. After repeating it 7 times, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz spinning counterclockwise at a rather ordinary speed and amplitude. This also meant that Walter's abnormality wouldn't bring him any danger. But this can only mean that I might not encounter any dangerous trouble through this problem. In addition, there's also another possibility. The danger depends on whether I make the appropriate choice. If I were to rashly get myself involved, something that isn't dangerous might become dangerous. Klein interpreted the matter with his rich experience. Just as he put this matter on hold, he suddenly saw the crimson star that represented the hermit coruscate as it burgeoned and shrank. Does this mean that the payment for scales of luck is here? Klein was delighted as he immediately emanated his spirituality. He was left disappointed because Katlia was only requesting Mr. Fool to pass on a message to the hanged man. She didn't mention when she would close the deal with the world. There are obelisks at the Abyss Maelstrom north of Sonia Island. Mr. Hanged Man is pretty lucky. At least he isn't like me, needing to enter the ruins of the battlefield of gods. Of course, obelisks can be dangerous as well. It's not easy to use one for a ritual. Mr. Hanged Man might even need see God's help. Ma'am Hermit's request is actually to help find the direct descendants of the Abraham family. This means that Queen Mystic is rather aware of Mr. Door's origins. The Emperor had mentioned it to her. Klein began making connections from Katlia's words as he threw the corresponding image to the crimson star representing the hanged man. At this moment, Alger Wilson had just finished his reports and had passed the examination, allowing him to return to the Blue Avenger. When he saw the endless gray fog and heard the hermit's words, he walked to the captain's cabin with a deadpan expression, keeping his pace normal. Upon entering the room and closing the door, he came in front of an alcohol cabinet, took a bottle of Lanty Proof, the most beloved drink of pirates, and poured half a cup. Alger immediately held the cup to his mouth and downed it like it was water. During this process, he kept his eyes half closed as though he was completely immersed in his own world. After drinking half a cup of Lanty Proof, Alger put down the cup, wiped his mouth, and chuckled. Abraham family's direct descendant. This might be very difficult for others, with almost 0 clues, but I can ask Miss Magician. Her teacher is one, Admiral of Stars still isn't aware of it yet. He quickly reined in his emotions and paced about, finally giving up on his idea and responded frankly to Katlia's request. Admiral of Stars won't only ask for my help. At the tarot gathering next week, she might announce this mission to everyone, and the others know that Miss Magician's teacher is a member of the Abraham family. There's no point lying about matters that can be easily exposed. I shouldn't jeopardize the possible transactions in the future just for some petty gains. At times, honesty is the best policy. Alger stopped walking as he reverently bowed his head and recited Mr. Fool's honorific name. He's informed Ma'am Hermit that she can directly ask Miss Magician for clues regarding the direct descendants of the Abraham family. After settling the request by Admiral of Stars, Alger took the initiative to mention his encounter during the night of the blood moon, and he inquired to Mr. Fool about whether the item that resonated with the ocean songster's Beyonder characteristic was the Book of Calamity, and if the female holding the golden cup in the coral palace was Kohan. Something like that happened. Queen of Calamity might really not be completely dead. It's likely that she had split her Beyonder characteristic, splitting them into the Book of Calamity and the one in the undersea ruin. Yes, there might even be a third or fourth portion, but I've no idea where they are. Klein confirmed without any hesitation that the elf was Queen of Calamity Kohan. This wasn't based on intuition, but a logical inference. He had once obtained the golden cup that elf Queen Kohainum loved, and a similar vessel had appeared in the dream. Elvish songster Saidas knew of Queen of Calamity's daily trivialities, and she had quite a strong relationship with the angel, which strongly implied that she was an elf that attended to Kohain. It was completely understandable that the Beyonder characteristic she left behind resonated with the Book of Calamity on the night of the blood moon. With this in mind, Klein suddenly recalled a matter. He had given Kohainum's beloved golden cup to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina for her to bury in Saidas' tomb. If Queen of Calamity really isn't completely dead, will the golden cup cause any form of mutation to the corpses of any elves close to her? Klein did a count of the time, and he discovered that he couldn't be certain if the golden dream had reached Sonya Island. After some thought, he calmly replied to the hanged man, "That's right." Following that, he forwarded the message to the Crimson Star representing the hermit. After doing all of this, Klein conjured the world Jayaman Sparrow and made him pray, "Honorable Mr. Fool, please tell Danitz to pass on a message to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards about the existence of any abnormalities between elvish songster Saidas' corpse and the golden cup." Phew, after doing all of that, Klein exhaled and threw the corresponding image to the specially labeled point of light beside him. He then returned to the real world and left the bathroom. Coming before his changing mirror, he looked at his gray sideburns and blue eyes as he curled up the corners of his lips. He knew that he had returned from being Mr. Fool to the mysterious merchant, Dwayne Dante. Bayam inside a primitive forest. Danitz, who was having a feast in a particular base of the resistance, suddenly trembled as he nearly choked on the liquid in his mouth. Although this wasn't the first time he was receiving an answer from the mighty fool, he still felt apprehensive and afraid. After he identified the figure and heard his words, he heaved a sigh of relief and knew that Jayaman Sparrow was getting him to do something. "As captain." "That's simple. The golden dream will be picking me up in a few days." Jayaman Sparrow isn't crazy, and he's even very sincere and reverent before the mighty fool. Danitz quickly relaxed as he leisurely thought. Meanwhile, on the future, Katlia, who had received a response that surprised her, muttered in silence, directly asked Miss Magician. Yes, she seems to be a Beyonder of the apprentice pathway. She's actually related to the Abraham family. As I expected, she's not simple. Katlia considered a moment and decided if she ought to give the hanged man a new mission, because she wasn't too sure if Miss Magician was willing to divulge clues to the Abraham family. Walter returned to 160 Bachland Street in the afternoon with a normal expression like before. He had apparently resolved everything easily. Klein didn't ask. He felt that their relationship hadn't reached a point in which his butler could be totally frank with him. Furthermore, the problem hadn't fully blown up before him in a way that couldn't be hidden. Time quickly passed as he had his lesson. The next evening, with the arrival of the full moon, Klein brought along Richardson and rode his high-end carriage to St. Samuel Cathedral for the moon mass. He wasn't worried about the donation that would happen, because Miss Justice had paid him £1,000. He now had £2,186, so it wasn't too difficult for him to donate a few £100. It's only not too difficult, Klein sighed inwardly as he looked at the bell tower outside, left the carriage, walked across the square, and stepped into St. Samuel Cathedral. After waiting nearly 10 minutes outside the prayer hall, Klein and the other believers who were here to join the moon mass entered under the priest's lead. In the dark and serene atmosphere, they heard uniform and ethereal chanting. Full-faced above the land stood the crimson moon, and sweet it was to dream of themselves, of child and wife and parents, but evermore. Holy and rhythmic voices echoed in the prayer hall as the believers involuntarily quietened down, as though they had forgotten all their frustrations in life or the different challenges they faced in the real world. Under the guidance of a few priests, they found their seats. In front of the altar, Bishop Electra, who was in charge of celebrating the Mass, held the revelation of Evernight and began preaching. As this segment came to an end, the priests held up water and bread, and they began handing them out to Klein and company. This was the loving grace of Evernight, food that people both alive and dead could share. Having not had dinner, Klein naturally didn't waste the bread of average quality and the water in the cup. Then he saw candles light up on the altar, and under the darkness, they appeared like stars in the night sky, emitting light and warmth that eased one's heart. At that moment, Bishop Electra led the few priests and everyone in the choir to chant in unison. We look upward into the night sky. We tenderly say her name, Evernight Goddess. We know no other words except Evernight Goddess. May the goddess draw out from the angel chorus with the silence sweet to gather, and hold both within her right hand which is gentle. Goddess, if she heard us, she would surely agree, smiling with purity at the dead, come, rest and sleep well, my children. The empty voice filled with holiness drilled into every believer's ear. It felt as though all the spirits present were resonating in unison. As a sequence 5 Beyonder, Klein felt as though his soul body was being cleansed as his spirituality naturally flowed out in comfort. Following that, a tranquil darkness seemed to appear before his eyes, a darkness without any sound. In the darkness, corpses lay there, their faces calm and at peace, as though they weren't dead and were actually in a deep sleep. Klein calmly traversed the darkness in a staid manner when he suddenly stopped and looked diagonally ahead. At a spot where moonflowers were silently blooming, there were a few people sleeping. They were the hatless Dunn Smith in a trench coat, old Neil, who still wore his black classic robe, and the short Kenley, who worked hard to save up money. They closed their eyes in a relaxed manner, as a faint smile appeared to show on their lips. Around them were erected tombs, each of them having the same word written on them, Guardian. Klein instantly closed his eyes as a holy and ethereal voice resounded by his ears. Cross your hands humbly, over your breast. Make the silent prayer, and shout from the bottom of your heart, the only escape is tranquility. Klein lowered his head, closed his eyes, and raised his hands up before crossing them before his chest. He then repeated silently, the only escape is tranquility. The only escape is tranquility. This repeated again and again, until the prayer hall reached a state of extreme silence. Only then did Klein open his eyes again and rubbed the corners of his eyes. He slowly exhaled and glanced around him. With the light from the candles, he discovered that most of the believers were covered in tears without realizing it. Even his valet, Richardson, was constantly tearing up without wiping his tears. The moon mass is akin to a ritual with Beyonder powers involved. Its effect is likely to make everyone's spirit resonate, allowing different people to see the deceased who they share deep relationships in the dark. It relieves one's grief in order to obtain tranquility. Yes, this isn't an abnormality that's targeted at Beyonders, so I can be at ease to ordinary people. This might be an illusory outlet that's instantaneous. They would only believe that it's a result of the goddess's greatness, and not some extraordinary powers. Sequence 5 Beyonders of the Evernight pathway seemed to gain a significant enhancement in their control of spirits. Klein withdrew his gaze as he made a judgment. Right on the heels of that, he recalled the darkness and the deceased that lay amidst the moonflower. Closing his eyes, Klein allowed his thoughts to drift. That dark plain filled with moonflowers, night vanilla, and slumber flowers is a manifestation of the goddess's divine kingdom. What does the source of danger in the nighttime, inside that battle of the gods' ruin, correspond to then? Klein gradually outlined the cold darkness and the fog that enveloped the sea on the eastern front of the Sanya Sea. In the fog, there was an ancient, pitch-black cathedral with a steeple. Ravens spiraled above it as though they were holding a memorial or were in grief. And around the cathedral were ordinary residents, simple wood huts, grayish-white mills, and indistinct figures. Logically speaking, this foggy scene that's intricately tied to the night, and dreams should be formed from the aura left behind when the goddess slayed Annihilation, demonic wolf. But it doesn't have any similarities with the corresponding divine kingdom. Yes, mortals can't pry into the secrets of deities, so perhaps the dark plains filled with flowers isn't the projection of the divine kingdom, but rather an outcome of the ritual. Seeing that the moon mass was coming to an end, Klein reached into his inner pocket and took out his wallet. Holding his wallet, he got up and entered the aisle, walked straight to the altar, and under Bishop Electra's compassionate watch, he walked diagonally over to the donation box. He tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion, drawing out the crimson moon before throwing in all his large denomination notes. A total of £300. At that moment, Klein didn't feel the pinch like the previous few times. He was in a very calm mood, because he recalled the ritual old Neil had used to repay his debt. Back then, they picked up a wallet containing £300, all thanks to the goddess's blessing. Taking a step back, he drew the crimson moon once again, and he gave his spot to the donor behind him. At that moment, Bishop Electra walked over and said as he drew the crimson moon, "May the goddess bless you. May the goddess know about it. What I wish for now is to receive some teachings," Klein replied with a smile. Bishop Electra glanced at the prayer hall's side door and said, "If you don't mind waiting 15 minutes, I can explain the Bible to you in the library." "T would love that," Klein said with a warm smile. Bishop Electra immediately got a priest to lead Dwayne Dentes and his servant out the prayer hall through a side door as they circled around a spiral staircase to the nearby library. There was a huge bookshelf here, and on it were various books from the Church of the Evernight Goddess. There were tables and chairs lining the sides for priests and bishops to study and preach to the believer. 12 minutes later, Bishop Electra entered the library with a calming smile and saw Dwayne Dantes with his white sideburns standing in front of a bookshelf, flipping through a book with great focus. He exuded the vibes of a scholar. "What are you reading?" he asked with a smile. Klein snapped the book together and said with a self-deprecating smile, "The Revelation of Evernight. To be frank, although I'm a pious believer of the goddess, I've never had the time to seriously sit down and read the Bible due to my busy life." As he spoke, he didn't show any odd signs on his face, but he felt uneasy deep down. He was afraid the goddess would smite him with a bolt of lightning to reward this pious believer, Dwayne Dante. Well, lightning isn't in the goddess's domain, Klein consoled himself. Bishop Electra smiled and took the Revelation of Evernight from his hand. "TT's never too late to begin." Following that, he invited Dwayne Dantes to sit down beside a table and systematically introduced the Revelation of Evernight's structure and the corresponding holy word. Richardson held his employer's hat and cane, and he stood a slight distance away, silently waiting to listen to the bishop's preaching. Time ticked by, when Klein, who appeared serious, suddenly felt his spiritual perception trigger. The scene outside the door naturally surfaced in his mind. This was an intuitive foresight that stemmed from a clown, one that had been enhanced by the gray fog. Outside the door, an elder dressed in a black clergyman robe walked by and headed for the nearby spiral staircase. He had lush white hair but didn't comb it, making him look rather disheveled. He had a thin face that made it appear as though he was bones wrapped in skin. He exuded a rather cold bearing, and his skin was abnormally pale. His eyes were a rare pure black. This figure quickly vanished from the door as the footsteps gradually sounded like they were coming from above. "A keeper? But it's not the one I met at the prayer hall, it's his turn today." Klein paid attention to Bishop Electra as he wore a contemplative look over the Bible's contents. He wasn't surprised that a keeper would appear inside the cathedral and pass by the library at this time. This was because the sealing forces behind Channy's gate would reach its peak at night. It wasn't suitable for living creatures to remain inside, therefore. The keepers only entered at sunrise and left at sunset. It had just turned dark. I need to remember what day and date it is today. Later, with more information, I'll be able to figure out the keeper's rotation schedule. This way, I'll be able to act as the corresponding target at the right time. Klein reined in his thoughts as he listened attentively. Finally, he got up and bade farewell 30 minutes later. He smiled and said to Bishop Electra, "I'm wondering if I have the honor to listen to your preachings in the future." "No problem." Faced with a tycoon who had just donated £300, Bishop Electra couldn't reject him. He even happily nodded. "As long as you come to the cathedral and I have the time." Klein didn't harp on the details to prevent any suspicion. He earnestly thanked him and left St. Samuel Cathedral with Richardson. He returned home before 8 and enjoyed dinner as he leisurely spent the rest of his night. Late at night, inside the master bedroom, the sleeping Klein suddenly opened his eye. His spiritual intuition told him that someone had infiltrated his mansion. Someone has infiltrated the compound. Klein didn't immediately sit up. All he did was turn his body to the side and reached his left palm under his pillow. He secretly held death knell, and at the same time he slowly spread his left hand open, preparing to activate creeping hunger. After knowing that it was difficult to find food for creeping hunger in Backland, he had infiltrated the prisons in Daisy Bay's Canant City, found an inmate on death row, and confirmed that there wasn't any mistake in the judgment before feeding him to the glove. The Rose School of Thought has locked on to me. No, it's impossible for them to be that quick. Besides, if it's them, They wouldn't just come but would wait for an opportunity. They will seize the opportunity when I'm passing by a secluded spot and strike so as to not alarm Backland's official organizations. I donated too much money at the Moon Mass, causing criminals to target me. A generous tycoon who just came to Backland from a foreign land is indeed an easy target. Of course, I can't rule out the routine investigations of the Nighthawks. As thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein heard a soft noise coming from the balcony in the adjoining half-open room. Right on the heels of that, there was the sound of a lock turning as the floor-to-ceiling window was pulled open nearly silent. Klein carefully listened and sensed the footsteps pass through the half-open room and into the corridor. After a pause, the footsteps walked towards the master bedroom before passing it, turning the doorknob to his valet's room. He went into the wrong room. Or could it be that he's here to find Richardson? Klein's heart stirred as he released his grip on death knell. He then reached out to the iron cigar case, which wasn't too far. After he removed the wall of spirituality, an illusory figure in a dark red coat and old triangular hat appeared beside him. It then walked into the full-body mirror. When Senner, the Wraith marionette, jumped to the glass window in Richardson's room, he saw a figure with orange-yellow skin, raven black hair, and soft facial features walk out of the room. As for Richardson, he was silently sitting by the edge of his bed, his body leaning forward. His back was hunched up like he was fused into the darkness. Horror colored his face as he showed a weak and stumped expression. Finally, he fell silent. The person is indeed here for Richardson. His traits resemble that of someone from the southern continent. He's agile and skilled. He's likely not an ordinary person. This is a friend that Richardson got to know at the manor in the southern continent. Or could it be a maternal relative? Richardson is only a valet with an annual salary of £35. What matter would need his help? Klein guessed as he used Senner's vision to observe. At that moment, he suddenly realized why Richardson was good at observation and often stayed in the balcony to size up any pedestrian. He was afraid of being found. I hope it's not too big a problem and won't affect my plans. Peel later divined the matter. If Richardson is unable to resolve the problem, I'll have to find an excuse to terminate his services. Seeing his valet lie back down, Klein pulled back his Wraith marionette. Meanwhile, Leonard Mitchell, who lived at 7 Pinster Street, once again entered the fog-immersed backland. He had previously questioned the Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph, and received the news that Sherlock Moriarty didn't proactively involve himself in Lanevis's matter. Instead, he participated in a discussion after being hired. This made any suspicions regarding him drop drastically. If it wasn't because this detective had been slightly involved in Capham's matter, and how he had a close relationship with Emlyn White from the Harvest Church, Leonard Mitchell would have had thoughts of giving up the investigation to continue his search for N.C. Zangwill. As Sherlock Moriarty didn't have many friends at the Quelog Club, with one of them dying in the matter involving Prince Edisac while the other was reporter Mike Joseph, therefore, Leonard only had one target left, Dr. Aaron Series. From the dossiers, this doctor was once involved in a Bayonder matter of the monster pathway. After the item was swapped, he stopped being unlucky or having nightmares. His life returned back on track. Most people that Sherlock Moriarty know are involved in Bayonder matters. This detective sure isn't an ordinary someone, as Leonard thought. He rang the doorbell in Aaron Series' dream. Upon entering the dream, he casually found a sofa to sit in and said to Dr. Aaron, who was opposite him, "Tell me in detail how you got to know Sherlock Moriarty." In the dream, Aaron didn't lie. He started from how Mrs. Mary had introduced Sherlock Moriarty into the Quelog Club, and how he was one of the recommenders. He continued until the detective suggested that he informed the Church of the Evernight Goddess's bishop about his abnormal matters. The truth is described in the dossier. Sherlock Moriarty seems rather friendly towards the official Bayonder organizations, and he was endorsed by Isengard Stanton. Leonard glanced at the mustached Sherlock, which Dr. Aaron conjured, and retracted his gaze as he listened attentively. After Aaron finished recounting everything in detail, he said, "He headed to the south for a vacation, and he hasn't returned. I've been worried about him all this while. However, he's a detective filled with wisdom and a kind heart. I believe nothing bad will happen to him. I just wish that he can participate in the celebration of my child's birth." Perhaps Leonard suspected that Sherlock Moriarty might never return to Backland. He then politely bade farewell and walked out of Dr. Aaron's dream. After taking a few steps forward, He subconsciously looked back and saw that inside the house, with a garden, blurry spherical lights that represented different dreams filled the entire space. Everything was fine. Was it a mistake on my part? I keep feeling as though something about me is changing, Leonard muttered as he turned to fly to Pinster Street. Everywhere he could see was covered in dense fog. The street lamps were gloomy and pale. Suddenly, Leonard stopped flying as he cast his gaze at a building. In that house, there were about 5 spherical lights floating in silence, making it look different from the other building. However, Leonard's spiritual perception told him that there was apparently a black blob in the house which could absorb all light. Furthermore, he discovered that he didn't recognize the street he was at. He felt alarmed, suspecting if he had seen something he shouldn't see. He hurriedly retracted his gaze as he prepared to leave and head for his residence. At that moment, the building that looked ordinary sounded with a teasing voice, "Why don't you come in for a cup of tea?" Thoughts erupted in Leonard's mind as he flew up at high speeds without even thinking. In his spiritual perception, the terrace houses lining the back, the garden and tiny buildings were burgeoning in size as the windows and doors turned into mouths that were biting at it. The nearby black street lamps were extending in height, making the surroundings appear like a forest of steel that seemed to stop Leonard. Leonard didn't stop or turn back. He felt a chill down his back as it became more obvious and deeper. His body slowly stiffened, as though he was being grabbed by countless invisible hands. Just as he felt that he couldn't hold out any longer, he saw a familiar house where a familiar window and light stood. He held his breath, plunged down abruptly, and fell back into his dream. He jolted awake and found himself drenched in cold sweat. Old man, what did I actually encounter? Leonard retracted his legs from the desk's edge and asked with a sense of lingering fear. The slightly aged voice in his mind replied after a few seconds, "Am not sure." Leonard's eyelid drooped immediately as he didn't pursue the matter. He then cast his gaze out the window and saw lights everywhere in the backland night sky. It was tranquil. 160 Bachland Street. Inside Dwayne Dante's mansion. "Sir, Ma'am Wahana Heisen is here," Richardson entered the room and said to Klein. Klein put down his papers and looked up, glancing at his valet. He discovered that he was still an apprehensive man of few words, silent and reserved. There was nothing odd with him. If it wasn't because the divination outcome was okay, suddenly firing an employee will incur suspicion, Klein silently mumbled. He stood up as though nothing had happened, and he got Richardson to help him wear his coat. 15 minutes later, he was holding his etiquette teacher, Wahana Heisen, in an embrace as he began to learn another common dance used at social events. "I feel as though I'll be losing my job in a few days." After a while, Wahana praised Dwayne Dantes for his progress. When she was done, she added, "However, you're still a little restrained. Although you don't have to act like Inti's men who cling closely to the ladies, you don't have to constantly maintain a distance. It's very normal to make occasional contact. The way you are behaving now makes you appear rigid and dull." Klein pulled her in a little and replied with a smile, "I was afraid of being rude." Does this mean that being too close to ladies is an act of rudeness? It also implies I'm full of charm, and that he might embarrass himself if he's too close. This is quite a euphemistic form of praise, Wahana thought and said with a smile, "You have learned well." The dance continued as Klein looked at Wahana Heisen's face as he asked warmly in a casual manner, "Ma'am, you seem frustrated." Wahana lowered her head and chuckled. "TT's nothing serious. My husband is a businessman, and he recently had some minor conflicts with some people. We can resolve the matter. Oh, your question was too direct. Before both parties have established a friendship, it's best not to ask about their matters unless she has made it obvious. Compared to you who comes and goes in families of high society, thus knowing many madams and ladies as a tycoon who just arrived in Backland, I do lack the necessary social connections." Klein nodded gently and said with a smile, "I thought we were no longer strangers." He then skipped the topic and began talking about his own experiences and his neighbor. Wahana would mention a few things in response, allowing Klein to better grasp the traits and preferences of his neighbor. After Wahana left, Klein stood at the door for some time before turning to say to his butler, "Walter, find out what trouble Ma'am Wahana is facing. If she can't resolve it, we will provide her with some timely assistance." Ultimately pay off in the evening, Klein, who had just returned from St. Samuel Cathedral, was just about to enter the dining hall on the second floor when he saw butler Walter walk over and say with a polite bow, "Sir, the matter you wish to be investigated has been completed." Klein didn't inquire further in front of the other servants as he staidly nodded. "Let's talk in the study." Walter followed behind him and came all the way to the third floor. Richardson then opened the door and lit the gas wall lamp inside. Klein unhurriedly walked to his desk, sat down, and looked at the butler for the report. As Walter gestured Richardson to guard outside the door, he approached the desk and deliberated over his word. After the door closed again, he said, "Ma'am Wahana's husband is a cloth merchant. He had been cooperating with someone and had invested £1,000 into it, but the other party ran off with the goods. She has already sought the help of Member of Parliament Mact and Ma'am Rihanna to urge the police department to crack the case as quickly as possible. However, the police usually doesn't dare to guarantee that they can find the target for such cases." Klein picked up the black fountain pen on his desk and stroked. To Ma'am Wahana's family, £1,000 isn't a small sum. Based on what he knew, an ordinary home tutor didn't earn more than £150 a year. If the employer provided boarding and lodging, the salary would be even lower. Although Wahana served high society and had many employers, her annual income capped out at about £400 to £500. Furthermore, a large amount of her expenses would be spent on her dressing, posture, and looks, to prevent her employers from finding her unfitting as an etiquette teacher. Yes, her husband's income as a cloth merchant can only be considered average. A £1,000 investment is a rather huge investment, Walter said by mincing his word. "It's a lot for me too," Klein sighed and smiled. "T just came to Backland, so I'm not very familiar with the police." Walter immediately replied, "Sir, back when I was under the service of Viscount Conrad, I knew a few members of a Backland High-Ranking Police Officer Association." Backland High-Ranking Police Officer Association. That would be the most important members at Civilhouse Yard. Even the chief superintendents who are in charge of an entire borough might not be qualified for induction. Civilhouse Yard referred to the Backland Police Department. It got its name from the street it was located at. As expected of a butler who served under a noble family, Klein sighed inwardly as he smiled with a shake of his head. "There's no need to do so for the time being. On this aspect, I'm sure Ma'am Wahana is able to seek the help of many people. Be it Member of Parliament Mact or others, all of them have the ability to make Civilhouse Yard place importance on the case." He paused and deliberately said in passing, "I've seen the lower rungs of society, and I know their methods of survival. At times, the police might not be as useful as gang members or bounty hunters. Walter, go to the police department to retrieve the corresponding details and head over to the famous bars in the Backland Bridge area and East Borough to commission a bounty mission. Regardless if they find the corresponding criminals or the batch of cloth, PLL be giving them £200 in return." Let's hope that those cheats had chosen to remain in Backland. A reward of £200. Walter repeated the sum as he couldn't help but steal a glance at his employer, as though he found it unbelievable that he would offer so much for Wahana's matter. He turned agape and was just about to say something, but ultimately kept silent. All he did was seriously reply, "All right, sir. TLL give you this money directly." Klein slowly got up and took out his wallet. As Walter received the thick wad of cash, he asked in thought, "Should I tell Ma'am Wahana?" Klein smiled. "There's no need." Enlightened, Walter nodded with a bow. "Your generosity will spread through this street." East Borough Derivy Street, in a cramped but lively pub. Zio, who had seriously combed her short, blonde hair before heading out, squeezed through the area filled with men that stank of alcohol and putrid sweat, and arrived at the bar counter. She tapped the counter and asked the bartender, "Any new missions today?" If it were anyone else who asked without ordering any drinks, the bartender would have ignored them, but upon recognizing Zio, a bounty hunter who no one wanted drinking, he could only sigh and say, "A very handsome reward, £200. £200? Zio nearly suspected that she had heard wrong. Apart from Miss Audrey's missions, she had never seen such a handsome reward in East Borough or the Backland Bridge area. Even the mission to seek out Isaac Eggers that drove bounty hunters crazy had only offered £150. For an ordinary bounty hunter, completing a commission like this was enough for them to not work for a year. Zio, it was equally important because she had been helping the mysterious man in the golden mask over the past few months. She had learned that the man was from MI9, and she was trying to earn enough contributions to exchange for the interrogator potion formula. Therefore, the reward she received when completing his tasks only paid a little. Most of it was exchanged towards her contribution goals, so all her savings came from the advantages that her sheriff sequence had given her to capture criminals. Once I receive the potion formula, I still have to spend money to buy the bay under ingredients, and I only have 300 odd pounds. Fours is right. Money isn't omnipotent, but it's sufficiently important. Upon having this thought, she looked at the bartender and asked cautiously, "What's the mission?" "Who commissioned it?" "Find a few cheats." They cheated the victim of cloth costing 1,000 pounds. As the bartender handed the details to Zio, he said, "The person who commissioned the mission looked like a butler. He called himself Walter, and he's in service of a Mr. Dwayne Dentes from Bachland Street. If you capture the cheats or find the cloth, you can head there to retrieve the bounty." Zio quickly flipped through the documents as something quickly formulated in her mind. She instinctively knew the direction in which to continue the investigation. "TL, take this mission," she said immediately with a nod. The bartender shrugged and said, "You aren't the only one. All the bounty hunters have taken on this mission. Besides, they have other ideas." "Like what?" Zio asked out of curiosity. The bartender chuckled. "They say that since Mr. Dwayne Dantes is so generous, they're willing to recommend themselves if he lacks a bodyguard. However, they later gave up on the idea since being a bodyguard isn't as free as being a bounty hunter. Even having drinks will have to wait until they're given time off." "That's not a problem for me, but I can only be a bounty hunter." Zio nodded, jumped off the high stool in front of the bar counter, and didn't waste time heading for the door. The next day, just as Klein finished breakfast and was preparing to head to his garden to have a stroll to aid in his digestion, butler Walter came in from outside and silently followed behind him until there wasn't anyone around. "Sir, there are 2 matters that need your attention," he said politely. "2 matters?" Klein was somewhat surprised. He thought that there would only be one. Walter nodded. "Yes, the first matter involves the 10% shares in the Bachland Bike Company. Someone has already offered 10,000 pounds. Sir, do you still wish to continue in the bid? It has been raised to 10,000 pounds. "Not bad at all." Klein deliberately acted stumped as he thought. "Team new in Bachland, and there are many things that need me to hold back on." "Let's leave it at that." "All right, sir." Walter then said, "The cheats who scammed Ma'am Wahana's husband of the cloth have been captured. The bounty hunter has already arrived and requested payment." "That quickly?" Klein turned his head in shock as he looked at his butler. If he had taken action himself, he was indeed capable of settling it that very day. After, he had dowsing rods seeking to find people, but the problem stemmed from the fact that most bounty hunters weren't seers. Yes, perhaps it's a beyonder good at tracking and searching for people. Klein made a preliminary judgment. Walter answered in confirmation, "Yes, it's much faster than I imagined." According to that bounty hunter, she did a reverse search from black market sales before finding the cheats. The black market peddlers gave in so easily. From the looks of it, they must have been taught a lesson with the fist. Klein nodded and said, "What's that bounty hunter's name?" "She's quite capable. She calls herself Zio," Walter answered truthfully. "No way." Klein almost stumbled. Thankfully, he had the impressive balance of a clown. After calming the upheavals through his heart while acting calm, he deliberated and said, "Keep the bounty hunter's contact method. Perhaps there might be a chance to gain her assistance in the future." "All right, sir." Walter didn't find any problems with Dwayne Dantes's instruction. Any decent member of high society kept some unofficial means to their chest. Klein didn't continue on the topic of Zio as he tersely said, "How much was reclaimed?" The cash and the yet-to-be-sold cloth from the cheats came up to about 850 pounds. Walter had apparently anticipated his employer's inquiry on the matter and had asked ahead of time. "Very good," Klein nodded and said. After paying the bounty hunter, help her send the cheats and the goods to the nearby police station. Northborough Police Station. Wahana and her husband, Bacchus, looked at the high-ranking inspector in front of them as they asked in unison, surprise coloring their voices. "TT's been found. They've been caught." The high-ranking police inspector smiled in response. "Yes." When he informed them how much cash and cloth was left, Wahana and Bacchus heaved a collective sigh of relief. They could afford 150 pounds in losses. Furthermore, the remaining cloth still had space for greater appreciation and profit. In essence, they hadn't suffered much of a loss. They repeatedly thanked the inspector until someone invited Bacchus to identify the goods and criminal. Wahana sat there without losing her etiquette. She smiled at the high-ranking inspector and said, "Your efficiency has exceeded my expectation. I'm very curious as to how you found the bunch of cheat." Being aware that this beautiful and elegant lady knew a member of Parliament of the House of Commons, and that she would eventually learn the truth, the high-ranking inspector didn't hide it from her. In fact, it was completed by a bounty hunter. She investigated the black market of stolen goods and quickly caught the suspects. "You even offered a bounty." Wahana seemed to gain a full understanding of the whole story. The inspector shook his head and said, "No, someone beat us to it. He offered £200. £200? Wahana asked in surprise. That wasn't a small sum of money, and it even exceeded the expected profit that her husband would earn from the sale. Seeing the inspector give an affirmative reply, Wahana couldn't help but ask, "Who was it that offered the bounty?" The bounty hunter didn't say, but accompanying her was a gentleman dressed as a butler. The inspector simply described Walter's looks. Wahana vaguely guessed at the butler's identity as she leaned back slightly, muttering softly to herself, £200. In the afternoon, Wahana, who came to Member of Parliament Mac's house to teach his daughter etiquette, first thanked Ma'am Rihanna for extending their help. After the blackish-green-haired Rihanna said a few words of humility, she asked, "Wahana, I heard that you're Mr. Dwayne Dantier's etiquette teacher. I wonder what kind of person he is." Wahana deliberated and said, "He's a true gentleman. He's warm-hearted, generous, kind, educated, gentlemanly, and very knowledgeable." Rihanna nodded slightly upon hearing that, before turning to look at her proud daughter and chuckled. "Unfortunately, he's a little too old or he might make a good match. Well, I plan on inviting him to our ball this weekend." Saturday night, 8 p.m. Klein rode his high-end carriage and arrived at 39 Buckland Street, Member of Parliament Mac's house, in 2.5 minutes after stealing a glance at the lit fountain that was sloshing with water. He buttoned his tailcoat and walked down the carriage before strolling to the house's main entrance. Richardson held an exquisitely packaged bottle of Southville red wine and followed closely behind his employer. After walking through the main door, Klein instantly saw Member of Parliament Mac and his wife, Rihanna, walk over to welcome him. The former was wearing an olive-green army officer uniform with an orange-red sash around his waist and a few medals hanging from his chest. The Lone Kingdom, serving and retired officers enjoyed wearing their military uniforms at ball. The latter was wearing a yellow long dress with frilly sides and rarely seen, exquisite lace, making her look different from unmarried lady. However, she also partially exposed her fair neck and her shoulder. Klein took the bottle of Southville red wine from Richardson's hand and handed it to Member of Parliament Mac before saying with a bow, "Sorry, I'm late by a few minutes." This was actually a common situation at lone ball. Guests would rather be late by a certain amount of time than be early. This was because the masters of the house might still be busy with the final preparations with the ball. It was the worst time for them to entertain guests, but of course, one had to ensure that they weren't late by more than 10 minutes. If Wahana hadn't specially taught him this, Klein would have definitely come early as a form of respect. "TD's fine. The ball hasn't officially begun." Mac glanced at the Southville red wine as he handed it to his valet before nodding with a smile. At Lone's high society engagements, one had to bring a gift for the master if it was their first time attending a ball. Alcoholic beverages were the most welcomed, but one had to keep in mind that the first gift had to be something locally produced. After greeting Mac, Klein looked towards Ma'am Rihanna and saw that she had slightly raised her right hand. Hence, he took one step forward and lifted her palm and bent his back to kiss it. "You illuminate the entire ball." Before the ball began, complimenting the masters of the house was a necessary step in Lone's social events. And unlike Inti's, Lone's hand-kissing etiquette required the lady to gesture that it was possible before a gentleman could do the kiss. Otherwise, it would be a serious faux pas. "Likewise for your arrival," Ma'am Rihanna replied with a smile. Then the couple led Dwayne Dantes through the corridor and into the main hall where a pleasant tune was echoing. After taking a few steps forward, Maury Mac pointed at a lady in a sky-blue dress. "My daughter, Hazel." Klein looked at the girl as his pupils suddenly constricted. He knew this girl. To be precise, he had seen her image before. Back when he had asked Arrows where he could obtain a mystical item which could steal the beyonder powers of others, the magic mirror had indicated a scene of an arrogant lady loitering in the sewers, and she was none other than Hazel Mack. She was a lady with wavy black-green hair and bright brown eyes. She has a mystical item that corresponds to a fire bandit. With her family conditions, why would she be loitering in the sewer? Is it some fortuitous encounter of hers? Was she searching for something or waiting for something in the sewer? She has already become a beyonder. How did she become one? Could it be that she has a grandpa parasitizing in her body? Klein, who was donning the skin of Dwayne Dantes, instantly thought of many questions, but he pressed his hand to his chest as he bowed with an unperturbed look. "Good evening, Miss Hazel." During this process, he stole a glance at Hazel Mack's face and discovered that she wore a composed look. There was an arrogance in her eyes, and all she did was smile politely and answer, "Good evening, Mr. Dantes." She didn't have any abnormal reaction, which means that she's unable to sense the aura of the gray fog. At the very least, there's no grandpa parasitizing her. I can't be certain for now, and I'll have to continue observing. Klein stood up straight as he took a cup of pale gold champagne from a waiter's tray. He then began chatting with Member of Parliament Maury Mack. "T never expected you to be a major." He could tell from the epaulet on Mack's shoulder. If he was a colonel, Klein would have even suspected if the gentleman was also a beyonder, but it was hard to tell for a major. "Haha, it's nothing. There are many opportunities to render meritorious services in Balam," Maury answered. "Of course, the weather there is especially unsuitable. I've always been suggesting to the Army's higher-ups to design a uniform for West Balam and to get rid of the traditional dark colors. Otherwise, the officers will only feel as if they are beef waiting to be roasted." As for the enlisted soldiers, most of them wore red tops and white bottoms. Yes, the weather there is completely different from what it's like in the country. Even Daisy Bay isn't that hot. Klein indicated that he had been to the southern continent, and he had been to either East or West Balam to corroborate his hunting experiences that he had mentioned a few days ago. After a few minutes of small talk, Mack apologized and walked to the staircase with his wife. At the second floor, he raised a cup of red wine while standing by the railings facing the main door and said, "Thank you everyone for coming to our ball. First, let us toast the deities. They are the source of everything beautiful." He and Ma'am Rihanna tapped 4 times on their chests as they softly praised the goddess. The other guests also praised the deities they believed in via their own means. Mack continued having his cup raised as he said with a smile, "Second, a toast to the kingdom. It is a stable bedrock." "To the kingdom." Klein raised his cup of champagne and spoke with the other guests around him. Following that, Mack surveyed the area and asked humorously, "Finally, what shall we toast to?" Klein's mind whirred as he said loudly with a smile, "A toast to the improvement of the air in Back." Mack was taken aback as he couldn't help but smile in response. "Excellent. That's a great suggestion. A toast to the improvement of Backland's air. This is a symbol of us living better lives. Cheers." The fixing of the atmospheric pollution issue had always been one of his political ideals as a House of Commons member of Parliament. He had ultimately been pushing for the corresponding bills, and he had played a significant role in the improvement of the environment. Therefore, toasting to the improvement in Backland's air was equivalent to toasting to himself. It was more euphemistic and more above board. All the guests echoed in a spirited burst as they finished the drinks in their hand. Right on the heels of that, Member of Parliament Mack held Ma'am Rihanna's hand, and they went down to the hall. They then started the opening dance in the mellow music. All the gentlemen present began finding their first partners to dance. Klein took another cup of champagne as he leisurely sized up the guests. "Ma'am Mary is here as well." He swept his gaze and found someone familiar. As one of the major shareholders of the Coim Company, with a wealth amounting to tens of thousands, Ma'am Mary had formerly hired Sherlock Moriarty to investigate her ex-husband's act of adultery. She's a member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, so it's normal that she has a close relationship with the Member of Parliament. Klein didn't attempt to invite her to a dance, since he here as Dwayne Dante. He didn't know this lady who lived in another street. He retracted his gaze and looked elsewhere. He saw Hazel Mack holding a cup of white wine and standing to the side. She wore a clear smile of alienation as she watched the gentlemen lock onto their targets to invite them for a dance. This lady actually looks pretty good. She's dignified and pretty. She should have been the star at this ball, with people yearning to invite her to a dance. However, the way she exudes that look of arrogance, looking down at people with a supercilious look, makes any gentleman who casts his eyes on her shift over to another target. I've seen this look in the eyes of certain Bayunders as well. They no longer think of themselves as mortal, and they often have a sense of superiority when facing ordinary folks. Heh heh. This implies that Miss Hazel is likely a Bayunder. That's right. If she isn't a Bayunder, how would she dare to loiter in the sewers? She's from the Marauder pathway. But how is she to act as a marauder or swindler with such arrogance? It's hard to imagine, seeing that the hosts were almost done with the opening dance. He began seriously considering who he could invite. Dwayne Dantes is in his early 40s, so it isn't appropriate to invite a lady for his first dance, unless it's someone confirmed to be a junior. And the first dance of most mams would be done with their husbands. I should be able to invite people I'm familiar with or the hosts. Klein swept the dance floor and found the only lady Dwayne Dantes was familiar with. It was his etiquette teacher, Wahana. Invite her? No, she likely already knows that I've secretly helped her. To invite her for the first dance can easily make her misunderstand. It might even affect her relationship with her husband and incur unnecessary trouble for Dwayne Dantes. It's not like I'm Emperor Roselle, who has a penchant for the wives of others. No, he has a penchant for everything. In short, I should avoid creating gossip. Klein shifted his gaze and heard the music change. It went from a mellow melody to something brisk. It was a piece of countryside music that was popular in Central Lone. It was well liked by nobles and was often used for the first dance. With the change in music, the gentlemen walked to the ladies and madams they had selected. Klein also noticed that no one approached Hazel Mack. She's one of the hosts of this ball besides. I can observe her at a close distance. Heh heh. If she really is a Bayunder of the Marauder pathway, it implies that the gray fog is able to converge Bayunders from the neighboring pathways of the Seer pathway. Klein wore a gentle smile as he unhurriedly walked to the arrogant lady. Miss Hazel, may I have the pleasure of a dance with you? Dwayne Dantes, with his white sideburns, gave a standard bow as he said. Hazel glanced at him and after a few seconds of silence said, "It will be my honor." She then extended her palm. Klein politely held her hand and entered the dance floor as they began a brisk and lively dance. Glancing at her beautiful but deadpan face, Klein said with a smile as he tried probing, "I just noticed that many young gentlemen wished to invite you to a dance, but they were unable to muster their courage." Hazel looked up and swept her gaze at him and said, "Mr. Dantes, that's not a polite topic." T40E Klein choked, lost as to how to reply. Circle, I thought she would contemptuously say that she doesn't like immature and incapable men, hinting that she isn't impressed with ordinary people. Who knew she can't even be bothered to answer this question. Heh, this sense of superiority will easily lead to a loss of control for subsequent advancements. Klein couldn't help but lampoon inwardly. From what he knew, Bayunders were only humans who had additional powers. It was equivalent to having plenty of money or status. In fact, they were still considered human, and had no way of escaping human society. Only by reaching sequence 4 would one experience a qualitative change. Furthermore, most demigods continue being active in human society. Even the sequence 1 snake of fate will Ossipton as being an obedient unborn fetus, perhaps only at the level of blasphemer Ammon, and the others will they be able to view the real world as a god. Klein's mind whirred as he said, "I'm sorry. I was once a merchant who often spent time in the northern continent and southern continent, and I have had little experience with a ball." Hey, I mean this type of ball. It's fine, Hazel replied calmly, as though she didn't care about the topic he had just raised. If it were anyone else, they would have been at a loss for a conversation with this arrogant lady. All they could do was focus on the dance, but Klein was considered quite a knowledgeable and experienced person at this point. He knew quite a bit of the different Bayunders in the mysterious world, so with his apology, he said with a smile, "This is a challenge that isn't simpler than the sea. It similarly has beautiful scenery, but hides countless difficulties. Of course, the sea also has stories of all kinds of treasure. Some of them are clearly fake, but others sound rather realistic but are impossible to verify. It's just like Death's Key that's ranked first amongst them." Death's Key? Hazel looked up at Mr. Dwayne Dantes, who was a lot taller than her. Indeed, a Bayunder with a strong sense of superiority would often have their interest piqued when it's something that involves mystery. Klein chuckled inwardly, and he nodded gently. Yes, it's rumored to be hidden somewhere in the Berserk Sea. He used the legends he had heard back when he was aboard the White Agate, as he added more of the details he had heard during his career as an adventurer. During this process, he couldn't avoid mentioning the four kings and the 7 pirate admirals. Hazel was clearly interested in these, as she responded to Klein in a rare instant. She would even occasionally ask other questions, making the dance between them less awkward. Without realizing it, their dance came to an end. Klein skillfully ended the topic and switched to asking, "Do you plan on returning to where you were, or do you plan on heading over to get some food?" After a dance, the gentleman had to abide by the lady's wishes and send her to where she wished to go. It didn't have to be where she originally stood. Hazel opened her mouth as though she wished to ask further, but she ultimately didn't speak further. She nodded her head in a reserved manner, "Where I was." She clearly misses the stories at sea. She's just a big brat. As long as you grasp her temper and find what interests her, she's actually not difficult to interact with. Klein held back his smile as he sent Hazel back to the periphery of the dance floor where she previously stood. As for him, he acted casual as he walked to the long table that had all kinds of food placed on it. He picked up a plate and began to scoop a serving of pan-fried dragonbone fish, and he matched it with some sliced black pepper steak. Compared to the dance and entertaining others, food is the true essence of a gathering, as Klein thought. He worked hard at trying to make his appearance while eating appear elegant enough. At this moment, he saw Ma'am Mary walk over and fork a piece of foie gras soaked in red wine onto her plate. When Klein saw her glance at him, he politely smiled with a nod as a response. "How may I address you? I haven't met you before at the balls and banquets hosted by Member of Parliament Mac." Perhaps it was because of Dwayne Dantes' gray sideburns and deep blue eyes that were very charming. The ordinary-looking Ma'am Mary with slightly high cheekbones took the initiative to ask. Klein laughed and replied, "I'm a merchant who just returned from Daisy Bay, Dwayne Dantes. I live on this street. Ma'am, do I have the honor of knowing your name?" Mary nodded in thought, and she roughly understood this man to be a merchant who was trying hard to enter high society, just like she was previously. She said with a smile, "Mary Scott, Coim Company's executive director." He didn't mention that she was the biggest shareholder of the Coim Company, or mention that she was a member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. This was a loan-styled euphemism. Mary Scott. She has taken up her original last name. Right, she has already divorced. Klein silently thought to himself and said with a smile, "I know of this company. Its main business is in anthracite and high-quality coal. It has expanded rapidly in the past few months. To be frank, I have the intention of investing in it, but I don't seem capable of competing with the rest." After the atmospheric bills were passed, there was a drastic increase in the demand of anthracite and high-quality coal. Coim Company managed to develop itself in ways that exceeded its past effort. Its overall valuation had already exceeded £250,000. Klein wasn't shooting his mouth when talking about investing, but that he believed that this industry would become even more important in the coming years until humanity found a resource to replace it. Mary had always been very proud of the National Atmospheric Pollution Report she pushed for, as well as the development of the Coim Company, so she couldn't help but smile when she heard that. This is because people are beginning to pay attention to the environment that they are living in. Having said that, she gently sighed and said, "As it gets better, trouble also increases as a result." Having just acquainted himself, Klein didn't ask about the trouble. With his prior acquaintance with Ma'am Mary, he easily found a topic of interest and had a good conversation with her. Her attitude towards Sherlock Moriarty and Dwayne Dantes is very different. Despite being someone she knows, just a change in looks and identity will be given a brand new form of treatment without any problems arising. This feeling is truly magical. As they chatted, Klein felt wistful as he felt that the additional faceless potion he had consumed was quickly digesting. After a few minutes, a handsome man with bright blonde hair walked over with a cup of red wine. He smiled at Ma'am Mary and said, "Mary, what are you talking about?" "Hibbert, this is Mr. Dwayne Dantes from Daisy. His experiences at sea and West Balham are truly interesting." Mary immediately introduced the two. "Dwayne, this is Mr. Hibbert Hall, the eldest son of the Earl of Eastchester. We should be calling him Lord, but he prefers people to address him as Mr. Chief Secretary. He's the Chief Secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. I've heard you mention him before." Of course, that was when the identity, Sherlock Moriarty, was still active. The Earl of Eastchester is a major noble in the nation. He's considered the top brass when it comes to high society. Klein politely bowed without appearing overly low. Please permit me to convey my thanks as an ordinary citizen. The work of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council has allowed us to live in better living environments. Hibbert Hall was rather pleased with such sincere gratitude, so he smiled in reply. This is all thanks to the hard work all of us have put in. By the side, Mary said with a smile, Dwayne, don't mention such matters again. You will make Hibbert arrogant. No, I was just joking. He's more humble than all the noble children I know. He should be having a vacation in the Eastchester County's fief at this time, and spending his time hunting with his friends. But he immediately returned after I sent him a telegram informing him that I was invited to this ball by Member of Parliament Mac. TT's not only for this ball. There are many things that require my attention. My father, Earl Hall, would also frequently commute between Backland and our fief before June, Hibbert seriously explained. A gentleman who places great importance on his social image, Klein made a preliminary judgment. When Mary heard that, she asked in passing, Is there anything still keeping you back? When are you leaving Backland? Most of my work has already been completed. There's only one matter left. My sister Audrey is very interested in the Backland Bike Company's 10% share. She hired a specialized team to help her in the negotiations, and I'm responsible for overseeing the matter, Hibbert said without much thought. Backland Bike Company's 10% share. What a coincidence. I have to say that the circle of high society is quite small after all, Klein sighed inwardly as he deliberately mentioned. I also found a team to attempt to purchase the 10% shares, but I only managed to offer up to £9,000. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to compete with the other competitors and could only give up. Hibbert glanced at him with a look of surprise. You have good taste. He didn't mention how much his side's bid was, to prevent his competitor from participating again. £9,000, Mary silently muttered, realizing she had underestimated Dwayne Dentase's wealth. At this moment, the music for the third dance sounded. Hibbert Hall turned to Mary and said, May I have the pleasure of a dance with you? That's what I've been waiting for. Mary immediately extended her hand. This made Klein unable to exchange name cards with them, however. He wasn't in a rush, because it was still some time before the ball ended. After getting another plate of food, he enjoyed it while looking at the dance floor, admiring the madams and ladies dancing. During this process, he noticed that Member of Parliament Mac and Ma'am Rihanna were mingling with different guests from time to time, having happy conversations with them, and even dancing with them. According to Walter, after confirming the guest list, the hosts need to seriously conclude every guest's preference and background, so as to tailor a different topic of conversation or jokes for them. This is to make everyone feel as though they are being treated uniquely. Socializing in high society sure is troublesome. This might be why Lonese gentlemen tend to have receding hairlines, Klein lampooned as he sighed in reflection. He retracted his gaze and looked at his cleared plate. He seriously considered if he should invite another lady or madam to a dance, or if he should eat a little more. At this moment, he caught Hazel Mack's figure through the corner of his eye. She was heading for the third story with hurried footsteps.